So, as I said, you have found your way to effectively welcoming LGBTQIA plus youth into our work. And here's kind of a little snippet. Issues around sexual orientation and or gender identity are often left unexplored in our child-serving organizations and agencies. Research shows us, however, that LGBTQIA plus youth often face increased levels of risk of harm by others and to themselves. So here together, we're going to learn how to effectively engage this underserved population through conscious use of language, self reflection, and inclusive organizational practices and policies. And to do this, we have an incredible presenter that I am so honored and grateful to introduce on the next slide. That would be Al Killen Harvey, who's a licensed clinical social worker with over 31 years at the Chadwick Center at the Rady Children's Hospital, where he has served as a trauma therapist, clinical improvement coordinator, reflective supervisor, and trainer. For anybody that's been to the Chadwick conference, you might have seen Al hanging out and sometimes even on stage, right? Al is also the co founder of the Harvey Institute, dedicated to improving healthcare outcomes through the integration of sexual health work that has earned the 2022 William Frederick Lecture Series Award from the Mayo Clinic. He serves on the advisory board of the Children's Advocacy Centers of of California, and co-chairs the Sexual Health Subcommittee of the National Child Traumatic Stress Network. Al has also served as an expert witness in sexual abuse cases and received the Community Collaborators Award from the San Diego LGBT Center. And with that, Al, we want to say welcome, welcome back. And we're so grateful for you and your time and this discussion.
Great. Thank you so much, Jess. I appreciate that really warm and personal introduction. We have a long collaborative and personal history together, so it's a joy to be here with you and with Casey, who's in the background as well. So hello, everybody. Thank you so much for taking some time out of, I know everyone's incredibly crazy and busy schedules these days to be here. I appreciate that. And more importantly, the youth and families that we serve are going to appreciate that because it speaks to already your commitment to make sure that we create these welcoming environments for this population. We have, give or take a little less than 2 hours, which in some ways seems like a lot of time, but in reality, to try to talk about a subject such as this one is not really a lot of time. And so I've had to really kind of think about what can we reasonably kind of accomplish with the time frame that we have and with the platform that we have. I will acknowledge up front a couple of things. I am old. That's no surprise. You can see that. So the technology is going to be a little bit of a challenge here a little bit. I outsmarted myself and I've got some videos that I want to share at some point in time. What I decided to try to do this time is I'm going to walk us through the PowerPoint presentation that you all have access to. I'm going to go through it relatively quickly just so you have a sense of what's in there to kind of ground us in general around this material. Then we're going to get rid of the PowerPoint for the bulk of the presentation, and we're going to use some videos as sort of case examples, case vignettes. I'm using a particular platform for that, which I'll explain when we get to it. But I find those discussions, for me anyway, much richer in talking about this other than just showing you a series of bullet points as you're seeing right now and doing that for 2 hours. That's for me quite tedious. It doesn't speak to who I am in terms of a relational individual. So we're gonna do some case examples, and then I'm gonna want to really hear from you. Again, I recognize the limitations of this format and also the advantages of this format. We're not in the room together, and so it's a little different, but we do wonderfully have access to chat and an ability for you to also speak out loud if and when you would like to. So I would like to hear your voices in addition to mine. If it's 2 hours of me, trust me, it's going to be dreadfully boring. So we don't want to do that. So here's generally what I came up with in terms of what I hope to somewhat accomplish, and hopefully a little bit more than that. But first and foremost, to just underscore the risk for this population. The LGBTQIA, we'll go through those letters in just a couple of minutes. But over and over and over again, the research shows us that um, even today, even today, despite the fact that we now have language, acronyms, we have modeling for what it is to be a queer individual in this world. Nonetheless, youth still face tremendous amount of risk both from others and from themselves. And so we're going to talk a little bit more about that and why that is. I want to be able to leave you with at least a couple of practical tools. That's what's most important to me. We can talk about this in the abstract. We can look at all kinds of research. We can intellectually understand. But if you don't take from this something that you can actually bring back to your practice, whatever the role is that you provide in the broader system, then I've not really done my job. So I really need you to kind of hold me accountable for that to make sure that this is concrete and practical for you. And we're going to talk a lot about families. We can't talk about queer individuals without talking about families. All queer individuals are connected to a family of some sort or another, whether it's the biological family, whether it's a foster family, whether it's a family of choice. Family is a key component for youth in their support, in their development, their protection, and we're going to talk about how important it is to engage those family members as well in the work that we do. So that's a bit of what I hope to accomplish in this short amount of time that we have here. And so with that, we're going to move on. So let's start first with this whole, what I call the alphabet soup, the LGBTQIA plus. And now for many of you, this introductory piece is information that's already foundational for you. I'm going to ask you to just hang in there, but we do want to level set a little bit to make sure everybody's on the same page. In your handout, you will see a listing of these words and these titles and these letters and what they mean. I'm not going to go through all of them, but I'm going to do just a couple, just to make sure that, again, we're all grounded in the same place around our terminology as we move forward. So let's do this just to keep you awake and keep you involved, so I'm not blabbing too much. In your chat box, really quickly, when our first letter in the alphabet is L. What's the L stand for? Just throw it in the chat box for me, please, if you would. And I'm going to access that chat box in a second. Take that down. So we have got, here we go. All right, we got a lot of lesbians in the chat box. That is always a great way to start a presentation. Nothing better than that. So super. Thank you so much for that. So yes, indeed, the L does indeed stand for lesbians. The G stands for gay. What does the B stand for? Really quickly in your chat box. There we go. We got our bisexuals either as two words, one word, hyphenated word. I'm not a grammarian, so I will say those are all acceptable. So any way that you want to look at that. So the B certainly stands for bisexual. Thanks for that. We'll explain these in just a couple of minutes. T, this one's always interesting for me. When you see the T, what comes to mind for you? What does the T stand for as far as you know? Really quickly in that chat box for me. So we got transgender, transsexual, transgender. Let's see what else we got. Okay, mostly that. Super, super, super. All right, great, super. I'm glad that I asked that one. The T does stand for transgender. Now that is the word that is most often used, and it is an umbrella term. We'll talk about that in a few minutes. Just for edification, and it's part of the reason that I asked it, and I appreciate that it was put in there. It often is. The word transsexual is generally not used any longer. Transsexual, for a variety of reasons. I don't have a lot of time to go into all of those, but first and foremost, that it focused strictly on sex, and transgender is really about gender. It's about a much broader concept. But by and large, the word that creates the most welcoming environment is transgender, not transsexual. So just to sort of kind of keep that in mind if you're trying to create that sort of welcoming environment. The Q, what does the Q stand for? All right, there we go. We have got queers and we've got questioning and we've got queer or questioning. This is the advanced group for sure. Thank you so much for that. Absolutely. So you may sometimes see in someone's presentation Q squared, two Qs. It can mean either queer and or questioning. And again, a couple of these I'm going to go over in a little bit more detail in just a second in terms of fuller definitions, but I just wanted what those letters are. The next one we get sometimes a few less responses to, less familiarity with. What does the I stand for in the LGBTQIA acronym? And wow, again, an advanced crew. So intersex, absolutely correct. That is right. And then let me get that one up here on the screen. And then A stands for asexual. And then the plus is to obviously acknowledge the fact that we are continuing to grow in our understanding of sexual orientation and gender identity, and that these letters and words that we've already put out here are by no means comprehensive. They are just starting points to understand the complexity of sexual orientation and gender identity. So the plus indicates much, much more. I am going to take you through just a couple of these words really quickly, just again to make sure everybody's on the same page, because language is crucial. Here's our first, I hope, takeaway from the presentation, if nothing else. Being conscious of your language. It is a way that we engage clients. It's a way that we telegraph to clients our understanding of who they are, if they are a member of this population, our comfort level with who they are, and our ability to be able to provide support for who they are. And that's a lot way down in language, but trust me, it's there. We hear from youth over and over and over again that one of the biggest barometers that they use in terms of whether or not they're going to share who they are with somebody, whether or not they're actually going to lean in and trust someone else, is by the language that they use and the facial expressions by which they use that language. Really, really important. So it's great to know these words and to know the clinical definitions of them, but how comfortable are we in saying them? So practicing the language becomes very, very important, because that is a way to telegraph to youth that you are here, you are comfortable, you want them to be comfortable, and you welcome them into your space. So very quickly, in terms of other issues around language, oh, let me add one other, which is not in my initial title, which is two-spirited. And again, I'm going to hold off on the definition of that as well. Sometimes presenters will put 2S in addition to the LGBTQIA. So the 2S would be for two-spirited, and we'll describe that in a moment. So really quickly, those words represent both sexual orientation and gender identity, two completely different concepts. Really important to know that, even though we are talking about both of them today, they are separate domains. But because of the nature of what happens for people who are exploring those parts of who they are, there is many similarities. But our sexual orientation is different from our gender identity. Sexual orientation is defined by who we're emotionally, romantically, erotically, and intimately attracted to, for the most part and over a period of time. Really important to know that around our sexual orientation. It is not based on just a behavior or a singular behavior, it's a constellation of things. So the fact that I may have had a same-sex sexual interaction with somebody does not necessarily tell me anything about my sexual orientation. It may be an introduction to that, but we don't know. That's a behavior. A same-sex sexual interaction is a behavior. Sexual orientation is beyond behavior. It's more than just the behavior, it's the meaning around that behavior. Did that feel good? Do I want that again? Does that speak to something internally in terms of who I am? So that's what our sexual orientation is. It exists on a continuum of feelings and attractions. For some of us, it can be quite fluid. We can find ourselves attracted to various folks who identify in various ways. It isn't necessarily always fixed over time. So I'm going to go through this pretty quickly because I think most of you have this, but again, just for foundational purposes. And it is not always necessarily congruent with behavior. And what we mean by that is that I can identify internally in a particular way around my sexual orientation, but due to circumstances, I may decide that I don't want to present that externally to others. So really quickly in the chat, if you would for me, please, anybody, why would somebody do that? What if, I'm going to give you a hypothetical. I am now 15 years old. I have been thinking and processing and feeling and exploring and questioning and agonizing for a number of years. And all of a sudden, I am now really internally clear on the fact that I am a female who is attracted to other females. And the word that I hear other people out there use in the world is lesbian. And so I am really believing that is probably indeed who I am. Why would my behavior to others, my expression of myself to others, be anything different than that then after I've gone through that whole internal understanding of who I am? Why might somebody not present in the way they know themselves to be internally? So we've got some issues here already. Safety, judgment, fear of judgment, society norms and family values and family reaction. Beautiful. Absolutely. Family pressure. Absolutely. So we really have to kind of respect that and keep that in mind, that what we see and how our clients may present to us may not truly be a reflection of what's happening for them internally. And so part of what we're here for today is, can we provide a space where they don't have to worry about those issues that you all just put in that chat box? They don't have to worry about our judgment. They don't have to be concerned that we're going to shame them in some way because of our value system that may not match with how we see them presenting. How do we get over that hurdle? And this is difficult for us in our roles because we're going against a culture that still sends out those sort of negative messages. So queer youth come into our organizations and agencies not expecting to be fully embraced, not expecting to be able to be honest and true about who they are. We've got to prove to them that this is a space where you can do that. This is a separate space than maybe the world that you've been living in 24/7 in your home, in your community, in your school. That's a big bridge for us, but it's one that I think we're all quite capable of if we really are committed to it. So sexual orientation is about romantic, erotic, intimate, emotional connections to somebody of the same sexual assignment. The words that we've used this morning, gay and lesbian, pansexual, which wasn't in our letters, pansexual meaning I'm drawn to people of various ways in which they present, and asexual, meaning that I am not, sexual desire is not a strong component of what happens for me. I may be emotionally attracted to people, I may be intimately attracted to people, but sexual desire is not very prominent for who I am. That's another sexual orientation. Whole nother presentation. Don't have time today to go into all of that, but really, really important for us to at least look at it as a component of sexual orientation. So these are some of the words that fall under those categories. So again, all of this you'll have access to later on, so I'm going to move through it relatively quickly. Gender, which is different from sexual orientation, we break into two components. Our gender identity is our inner psychological sense of who we are as it relates to the gender spectrum. And gender operates on a spectrum. Despite what you may be hearing, gender operates on a spectrum. And there are variations in our understanding of ourselves as male, female, both, neither, some component of all. It is a really quite fluid kind of component of who we are. My gender identity is how I understand myself internally, regardless of what I say to others. These terms are quite loaded. They're quite packed with cultural value systems. So we have to keep that in mind. They're very relative. So how one defines oneself and expresses oneself as male or female may be very different in different parts of the globe, may be very different in different parts of the country, may be very different in different families. So these are very relative and subjective sort of terms, and yet they are crucial. It's how many of us orient ourselves to others is based on our perceptions of their gender and gender roles. So our gender identity is an internal sense of how I identify male, female, both, neither, fluid. And our gender expression, therefore, is what I communicate outward. So what I show to others, regardless of what's happening internally for me. So the letters that we used today were transgender. As we talked about before, transgender, it's an umbrella term, and it's for people whose gender identity or gender expression differs from the expectations associated with the sexual assignment that they were given at birth. So let me describe that term because I've mentioned it several times. When a child is born, there is a sexual assignment determined. In most countries, including in most places in the United States, that is limited to two categories currently. The sexual assignment of a baby is male or female, and that's it. That's their sexual assignment. Gender is about something much more than that. So regardless of the sexual assignment I was given at birth, at some point in my, if at some point in my life, I realize that that does not align with who I know myself to be. My birth certificate says that I'm male, but I don't identify as male. That in whatever way that is. This is again a very personal, very subjective process. But for me, for example, if I were to say male does not fit for how I know myself to be, that's the beginning of my understanding of myself as a transgender person. I am going beyond what was assigned to me as a label at birth to understand the fuller complexity of my gender internally. Cisgender, a relatively new term. Some of you may or may not be familiar with it. Cisgender is a person whose gender identity does match that sexual assignment. I, for example, am a cisgendered male. I was given the sexual assignment of male at birth for my entire life. That has never been in question for me. How I understand male, and that's a long narrative in my own head, how I understand that concept of being male feels very congruent with how I feel internally and most of the time how I express myself. I can express myself quite fluidly around my gender as well. But in terms of my understanding of myself as a male, I am a cisgendered male then. It is consistent and fluid and aligns with how I was assigned at birth. Transgender would be if it didn't. So again, I'm going to move through that relatively quickly. Some other terms you'll hear, genderqueer, intersex was our I letter. These are individuals who are born with chromosomal and or reproductive differences. They may have an extra or missing chromosome, have some elements of both male and female reproductive systems, have genitalia that doesn't appear to be clearly male or female at birth. So intersex individuals comprise actually probably a bigger portion of the population than most people realize. The statistic I was given once, which is the easier one for me as opposed to numbers, proportionally speaking, there are about proportionally about the same number of folks who are intersex in the United States as folks that are redheaded. So we know that redheaded folks are not the majority of folks, but they are also not an anomaly. There's a significant number of folks. Intersex, same component. So just so you get an idea that this is not a complete anomaly, it exists for many individuals. Again, intersex, whole nother conversation in terms of the complexities that go with that, the medical kind of positives and negatives that have happened for intersex individuals, and what life challenges are for them. But intersex folks oftentimes experience many of the same challenges that LGBTQ individuals do as well. And so that's why we include them in our presentations. So just again, more terms. Let's go to two-spirited. Some cultural terms here. Two-spirited is a term used by some Native American and Alaskan Native or Indigenous folks to describe variations in sexual orientation and gender identity. So two-spirited, and there are other terms used depending upon the culture and the community and the Indigenous population. I did some work many years ago in American Samoa. Fa'afafine would be a term that would be used there for this component. What's important for us to know about the concept of two-spirited and other terms around this is based on those cultures, we know that fluidity around gender and sexuality has existed for as long as humanity has existed. Our indigenous ancestors have told through pictures, through storytelling, have described this fluidity within their communities. So this is not a new concept right now. We are giving it terms now, and maybe in our culture, that is oftentimes based on Western European sort of history, we are looking at this as if there's some new phenomena here around being gay or lesbian or bisexual or trans or gender fluid or non-binary. And in actuality, if we look to our cultural ancestors in the indigenous populations, these concepts have existed forever. And more interestingly, were welcomed and celebrated in many communities, not looked at as wrong or bad or pathological or sinful. They were actually looked at as creative and interesting and adding to, more powerful than the others. really fascinating things that we can learn. Last thing in terms of culture and language, some term that you may hear at times is Latinx, Latina, either one or both, and that's a gender neutral or a non-binary alternative to the terms Latino or Latina. For those of you that are not Spanish speakers, the Spanish language, like many languages in the globe, nouns are assigned either a male ending or a female ending. So an O would be a male ending noun, and A would be a female ending noun. It doesn't really speak much to the gender of the noun. It's just the way the language is constructed. But because it's constructed that way, when one is trying to apply it to themselves, we can get into a bind. If I identify as male, but I don't identify, I am given the sexual assignment of male, but I don't necessarily identify as male internally, and yet I am of Mexican origin or ancestry, the word I'm kind of up till now had been assigned would be Latino, because you look like a male and you are Mexican, and so you are Latino. If that's not congruent for me, there was no alternative in my language. So Latinx or Latine are words that are being proposed in an alternative because they don't assign gender to who I am. I can describe my cultural history and my cultural identification without being labeled with a binary male or female. I know there's a lot to unpack in all of that, and I'm moving fast, but hopefully that's enough to at least get you started on it. All right, so that's where we are a little bit with language. Now we're going to do our first, fingers crossed, our first try at technology here. I am going to stop sharing this screen for the moment, and I am going to hopefully call up our videos, because that was a lot that they just took you through, and I want to acknowledge that. There are a lot more words that are being entered every single day, and it can be overwhelming at times. And so I want to add just a little, maybe slightly humorous video here to also acknowledge how hard it is to try to stay current with all of this. So with that, I am going to share in a second. There we go. Right. And I am going to, great. I think I am ready to go. Go for it.
Oh, hold on just a minute there, Buster.
Dad, I'm supposed to pick up Emily in like 10 minutes. I gotta go.
Well, Emily can wait for a little bit, can't she? You got a minute to talk to your old man, don't you? Have a seat. Ah. You know, son, you're not a kid anymore.
Oh, no, I go to health class, Dad. I already know all this stuff.
Well, they're gonna teach you about everything in health class. Okay, Mr. Smarty Pants? So just listen. When boys and girls get a little older, they start getting interested in one another, right?
You know, and non-binary people, agender, intergender, FTX, gender fluid people.
What?
There's more than just boys and girls now, Dad. And they're not girls, they're women.
Yeah, okay. Okay, sure. Well, my point is that sex is it's a very important decision.
How are you defining sex? Sex is different things to different people.
I guess when a penis goes into a vagina,
What if there's 2 men or 2 women or more?
more.
How would you define sex with multiple simultaneous partners? Or what if somebody's undergone genital reconstruction or is intersex?
No, but I'm just talking about normal, straight.
Normal. Come on, Dad.
Okay, here we go. Let me ask you this. Son, are you attracted to women?
Yes, but I'm young.
Is Emily a woman?
Biologically.
Okay, you're attracted to women. Emily's a woman. So if you were to have sex with Emily,
I wouldn't just have sex with Emily. We'd have to make that decision together. Homecoming's not an excuse to ignore consent.
I'm not saying to ignore consent. I never said ignore consent. You and Emily, right, consensually decide to have sex.
Vaginal?
Yes, vaginal.
Just 2 of us.
How many people do you want? Yes, just the 2 of you, Colin.
And I'm playing the traditional male role.
Go to homecoming.
You seem like you really wanted to talk about this.
No, I don't want to talk about anything ever again.
So I can go.
Please do. Oh, thank you. Don't forget your corsage.
Hey, Dad,
Yeah.
how do I look?
You look very handsome, son.
That's gender coding, but
Get out of my house. Have fun.
Okay, so hopefully that provided a little bit of levity for folks. So it really speaks to this idea of um, how difficult it can be to try to stay current, right? Yet how important language is, particularly for young folks. It does give them some sense of where we are and how we're feeling and what we know about this incredibly important subject matter. So with that, we're going to go back to our PowerPoint here. Oops, let me just finish this. Escape there. All right, so you should see that. So let me look for a second. Any comments on the video? Anything come to mind when you saw that? Very funny. Okay, I will give you a reference to how to find the video later on. Great, and Casey's indicating that she will give you the link for that as well. Okay, good. So I'm glad that many of you can relate to that in some ways. That's awesome. That's what I was hoping for. So it's also to give us a little bit of a breather here, right? I took you very quickly through that language component, and the other thing that I have had to learn is incredible humility around all of this. And so being able to say to my clients, I may not be current on all of this stuff. That there may be times in which you may have to help me understand what you're comfortable with, what you mean by certain words. Even though I took you through a little bit of the definition of terms, I do want to caution folks that we need to be careful. That is just to give us an orientation, a general orientation to sexual orientation and gender identity. But what's most important is how does the client in front of you identify? What do they know about themselves? Most importantly, what do they want you to know about themselves? And what language feels right for them? What words do you want me to use if and when I'm talking about this component of your life? What words feel most empowering to you? Tell me that so that I can be affirming in that. For me, as a much older man, a gay man in particular, I have had to really practice using the word queer. That is a word that historically was used in such a negative way and still internally brings up a feeling state for me. Yet with many of the young people that I interact with, that word has a completely different connotation for them now. They see it as a positive, they see it as a welcoming word, they see it as a much more inclusive word than the words gay or lesbian or bisexual, trans, all of these components. And so I have had to learn to practice to be comfortable with using that word queer and not look the distress on my face or cringing or whatever. If and when a client says to me, that's the word that most resonates for me. So have that conversation with your client. Ask what feels best for them. And as long as it's a positive component, try as much as you can to embrace that. So quickly talking about some risk factors, let me again engage you a little bit in the chat. When you think of risk factors for this population, what are some of the risk factors that come to mind for you? Somebody that may identify as queer, LGBTQIA+, what particular risk factors might we expect to see with some of those individuals? And we'll talk about the caveat around that in just a moment. So suicide, that's the one that most often I think jumps for everybody to the top. Family rejection, hate crimes, depression, absolutely. Homelessness, thank you so much for that. And homelessness, I always include being unhoused is a gateway risk, right? In and of itself, it can lead to a whole host of other risk factors when somebody is unhoused and does not have stable, permanent, safe housing of any sort or another. Substance abuse, absolutely. So let's go through some of these a little bit. I really appreciate you all jumping out at those, and we've got some understanding around that. Really quickly, homelessness, we see figures that continue to remind us of the sizable number of queer individuals that may be living on the street. And most times those individuals identify the reason that they're in that situation is because of their sexual orientation or gender identity. And so keeping that in mind as we move forward, and also looking at resources related to this. This is a population that we still do not have adequate resources for. We don't have adequate resources for the unhoused population of adults. We know that. It is one of the biggest social challenges that we are facing these days. Now imagine when you're a queer individual and a queer youth and you are unhoused and trying to find resources for that. And sometimes even the organizations and agencies that do exist to provide some sort of either emotional support or physical support for unhoused people don't necessarily have the training around sexual orientation and gender identity. And so, a youth may present at an organization or an agency or at a shelter and still be having to deal with the heterosexism, the homophobia, the transphobia that may have caused them to be unhoused to begin with. And so we really, for those of us that are in a position in our agencies and organizations where we make resource and referrals, I really, really, really encourage you that if you are lucky enough to have some resources in your community for unhoused queer youth, that you also question those individuals in those organizations about their understanding of sexual orientation and gender identity. The last thing that I want to do is to work with a queer youth who's been thrown out of their house, who has no other place to live, and now I find them a resource and they get to that resource and they face the same sort of oppression and discrimination that caused them to be unhoused from their own family. That then also destroys any sort of trust in me as well. So I'm a pretty rabid sort of advocate for my clients when I am going to make a resource referral. So calling an organization or an agency, this is for any of the issues that we're going to talk about here, calling organizations and agencies that you partner with and asking very specific questions around what kind of training their staff have on sexual orientation and gender identity, what's been their experience in working with queer individuals. If you get answers like, well, we work with everybody, we're just a welcoming environment. That's a lovely thought. I appreciate that, but that doesn't give me enough. I need to know more than that because this population needs to know that you have a broader understanding of who they are. So being very, very kind of fierce advocate for our clients is super important. So unhoused youth, queer youth, are also at risk for many of the other issues that were presented in the chat when I opened this up. Certainly for substance abuse, we know that. Interesting stats around substance abuse that we are finding. There used to be, back in the day, when I first started doing these trainings over 30 years ago, we used to believe that queer individuals, adults and adolescents, had a higher rate of substance abuse than other individuals. We just took that as a given, and we all sort of assumed that that sort of made sense, right, because of the marginalization of those populations. Actually, what research has shown over time and currently is that the substance use rates within the queer community and within the non-queer community are in the adult population are actually pretty similar. There's similar ratios. The one difference is for individuals who have not fully come out, for individuals who are in that questioning stage, struggling around, trying to identify or knowing who they are, but not feeling safe in coming out. There, we tend to see a disproportionately higher rate of substance use and misuse and abuse than in the rest of the queer community, where it's about the same as it is in the heterosexual and cisgendered community. So interesting little thing that we've learned over time that we didn't always know. Suicide was mentioned, super important. It's one of the statistics that we have been tracking. The federal government has actually been tracking up until recently. The federal government has been tracking for over 30 years, and we continue to see a disproportionate number of queer youth who consider suicide, attempt suicide at some point in time, disproportionately to their heterosexual and cisgendered peers. That risk factor just remains constant no matter how much information and education we put out there. So it's always got to be on our radar screens when we're interfacing with our youth, is to be asking for it and proactively asking for it. I know most of you know this, but there is still some myth or stereotype that you shouldn't ask about suicide or depression if it's not really obviously present, because you may in some way kind of create an idea in somebody's mind that's just, there's no research to support that whatsoever. If you ask somebody, have you considered suicide at some point in time, and they haven't, and it isn't part of what's happening for them, they are not going to magically all of a sudden consider that. They are going to basically say, no, it isn't, or why are you asking me such a stupid question? That's fine. I'm willing to ask the stupid question for those few folks who it is true that they've considered that, and I now may be able to be a source of support. So proactively asking about depression and suicide are really crucial, particularly for this population. So I'm going to skip through the rest. You'll have all of this in your handouts. Lots of other stressors out there. There's racism, misogyny, transphobia, ableism, also within the queer community. So just because we get our queer youth at times connected to support organizations and other places that are queer identified does not mean that those places are free of a lot of the other emotional stressors that are out there. Even within the queer community, we have our own racism, our own misogyny, our own transphobia, and our own ableism. It exists there as well. And so we need to help guide and navigate our youth through that. They many times believe that if they and when they access that queer community, they've accessed this rainbow coalition where everybody loves everybody and all of these other issues don't exist. And I would love to say that that is true, but it isn't. And we have to be honest about that. So we need to be able to help guide our queer youth through that sort of grief and loss as well when they face the realities that the queer community, like any community, has its issues. All right. I'm talking very quickly because there's so much more I want to get to. Family response, we'll get to it in our slides, and I mean in our case presentation. And the biggest thing I want to point out here is incredible work done by Dr. Caitlin Ryan, San Francisco State University, the Family Acceptance Project, which is in your resource listing and will be given to you as well. Great research project that is now an organization of its own that is really working very, very hard with families around the impact that family rejection has on the identity development for queer individuals. And that if we can change the ways that families respond, even moving slightly from rejection to a more neutral stance, can literally change the life outcome and health outcomes of queer individuals. Dr. Ryan's research and other people now have shown over and over and over again that the queer individuals who struggle the most with issues around mental health and substance abuse are the ones who have experienced the most amount of family rejection at the beginning. And so working with families very hard around how do we navigate this issue and how do we find a way, even if I can't fully accept that I have a queer child, but how do I at least minimize the negative reactions and responses that I give to my child that might then lead to a trajectory of very poor mental health outcomes. We'll talk about that in our case vignette some more, but I just wanted to make sure you're very aware of the Family Acceptance Project, really great program. Okay, we're going to skip the rest of this. So you have some sense of what's in the slides. I wanted you to kind of see all that. You'll have all of this available to you. And at the end, we're going to talk about the importance of creating this welcoming environment for our clients. We're going to tie that to our videos. So with that, we are going to move to the videos. Let me stop sharing here for a second. And I'm going to stop there. So I threw a lot at you really, really quickly. Just quick observations, questions, concerns. What I'd like to do for the rest of the time that we have, a little over an hour, is give you a couple of case examples where we're going to tie some of that stuff and expand on it a little bit, but through the lens of an actual family and an actual individual. But what's coming up for people right now? Just if you could throw some comments in the chat box. This is landing, this is not. I'm a little confused. You talk too much. You're not talking enough. Anything. I'm an open book here. So great. So far I'm hearing, I really appreciate you're going over this. Love the term fierce advocate. Great. I appreciate that. Steal it and embody it, more importantly than stealing it. Okay, good primer. Thanks, Jen. Good to see you, by the way, Jennifer. I'm glad that you're here. Nice to have some friends in the audience. I'm sure you're all friends at some point in time. I would love that. So far we're good, right? Everybody is okay? Any quick questions right now that jump out of what we've seen? We'll have a little bit of time at the end as well, but if there are questions, feel free to throw those in. I'm going to ask Jessica and Casey to jump in and let me know if those come about. Okay, we've got one already, so somebody's taken me up on that. How can someone go about education for schools when I live in a very red, reserved rural community? I was prepared for this question. So Samantha, thank you so much for bringing it up. And I probably should have started with this. I plunged right into this presentation without a real current context. Um, and I think what's really important for us, first and foremost, and you can all appreciate, I think, where the line that we have to straddle here. But this is not a political talk, a presentation, and yet you cannot talk about sexual orientation and gender identity without talking about politics. There's just no way. You can't. And so we have to acknowledge that we are living in a very different time now than even a year ago for queer individuals and for queer youth. Things have changed dramatically, regardless of how you feel about it. The landscape is very different. The landscape is much more challenging now for many communities to provide the resources and the support that queer youth need. That's just a reality. Unfortunately, Samantha, I don't have a quick fix for you. I am empathic to the situation that you're in. What I would say to folks and this is very simplistic and I will own that. And I'm going to work on a better answer over the next couple of months as I too try to wrap my head around where we are these days. What I would say is that we go back to basics here. That if we don't, and if our clients don't have the full access to resources in the ways they used to, or maybe never did, but in the ways that we would like them to, never underestimate the power of what you can do with that individual. So I may not be able to provide them with all the other resources that I would with any other kid on my caseload because of the current situations that we're in. But the relationship that they have with me may still be the most important thing that they carry with them and may be enough to help them weather through this really challenging time. We can't underestimate the power of the personal relationship that we have with them. You affirming them, you saying, I know that you have to go to school every single day and face all of this horrible stuff, and that feels awful for you. And I know that I can't change that, even though I would like to. And I know that you can't change that, even though you would like to. But what we can do is, in the time that we have together, then this becomes your space to be who you need to be, and for me to make sure that I affirm that in any way that I can. That is powerful. That has meaning and purpose for our youth. And that is something we can do. So far, we haven't been stripped of our ability to interpersonally do that ourselves, even though we may be working in systems that can't, unfortunately, support that any longer. My best answer to that, Samantha, and I wish it was a better one. But again, it is something. And so that's what I would say to sort of focus on. Great. So let's go in and do a little bit of using a case example to kind of see where we go with this. Okay. So just based on that little bit of clip that we have of Miles, what did you hear in there in terms of some of the stressors that he's been dealing with as a young Black man living in the community that he's been living in? What comes to mind for you? If anybody would like to speak out loud too, I'd be happy to have that. Just put your name in the chat box saying I'd like to talk. It's easier than chatting, and would love to hear your voice, but whichever way works for you all. So we have hate speech. Yep. Thanks, Rory. Miles says at one point, just walking down the street, I was called the F word. I was called the N word. So hate speech, both about his perceived sexual orientation, and also hate speech about his culture and his ethnicity and his race, right? So having to deal with all of that. Loss of true connection, right? He says several times this feeling of loneliness. I felt so alone. And that is probably, for me, The one area, if I don't have a lot of time, if I don't have a lot of connection with someone else, um, the one area I want to work on in if somebody is willing to work with me that is in this process of coming out is that whole idea of loneliness and isolation. I hear that theme over and over and over again for queer individuals. I felt like I was the only one. I felt like nobody understood me. I had to deal with this all by myself. I couldn't even tell my friends because what would happen? And so, again, a practical, pragmatic thing to think about is there a way that if I am working with a client, that is part of the central narrative, that I can help break that isolation. Now, we are breaking it, hopefully, partly by our work that we're doing with them as our support, whether we're an advocate or we're a therapist or we're a probation officer, whatever our role might be. We are trying to break some of that sense of isolation by affirming them, but they need more than that as well. And so thinking about, is there a way that I could connect them in some way? Now, we may not have physical resources within our community because of where we are, but the good news is now there are so many virtual communities out there that are safe and positive and affirming for queer youth. So can I get him, her, or them connected to that kind of place to start to break that sense of isolation, where they get to see some modeling from others to say, I am not alone in this. There are others that have had to deal with this. So thanks for pointing that out. That was really super important. The sense of rejection. Miles talks about rejection from family, rejection from church, rejection from community. That's a really big wound for many queer individuals. And being able to allow time to talk about that and to process that. A theme that you'll hear from me, this is partly comes from my work in working with queer youth. It also comes from my work in being a reflective supervisor. Many times, those of us in the helping professions in the social service arena, when we are faced with these sorts of hurts and pains and wounds that our clients bring to us, many of us still kind of reflexively try to fix immediately. And I am going to caution folks that unless we are talking about something that is truly life-threatening, I'm going to caution folks to slow down a little bit and to think about, can I sit with the pain with the client? There is tremendous value, tremendous healing even, that can come from our queer clients by affording them the opportunity to talk about that pain. Now, they may initially say, it just sucks to go to school and everything is awful. And we feel like, oh, well, I don't want to open that wound up anymore. So how do I help them move beyond that? But I'm going to suggest that if you haven't already, if it isn't part of how you work, that you sit with that a little bit. First of all, look at yourself. For those of you that are not clinicians, I'm going to use a little clinical word here, but I will explain it. You want to look at your countertransference, right? What's happening for me? Is this bringing up some of my own wounds, some of my own hurt, even if I'm not queer identified myself? We've all felt rejection. We've all felt loneliness. Many of us have been bullied for various reasons, or marginalized, or felt left out for many reasons. Have I worked on that? Am I aware of that? Is that getting in the way of my ability to be present with my client who now needs to talk about that? So that's number one, looking at myself. Then when I've done that work, can I sit and offer the space to my client? Can I say to Miles, can we talk a little bit more about what that was like? 14, 15, 16, walking down the street, being called the F word or the N word. What do you remember about that? What do you remember feeling inside? What do you remember wanting to do, if anything? Welcoming that in, welcoming that pain and that hurt in, can be really important in healing. Many times that is also part of the loneliness, is I have nowhere to go for somebody to just truly hear how hurt this all is for me. So I have to put on a brave front. I have to pretend it doesn't hurt. I have to not tell someone else for fear of letting them in on that other part of my life. And then I don't get to actually process it myself. So I really encourage you to see if you can sit with some of that pain sometimes. This connection from family was really present, right? And it's really interesting. You know, I've seen these clips a bunch of times, so I get to see little nuances that I didn't notice the first time around. But he Miles in his presentation starts by talking about how lucky he is to have the mom he had, because in this community, you know, if you're gay, you're out. And so you start out with this idea, wow, she must have been amazing. And I wonder how it was that she was so open and accepting right from the beginning to Miles. And then when Karamo asks him a question later, he does acknowledge that no, she wasn't always accepting. It was a journey for her. It's a journey for all parents. We'll talk some more about that as we go through a couple of the other clips. But really kind of interesting how his first presentation was kind of a cleaning that all up, kind of talking about maybe where she is now in his life. But that was a really important question that Karamo asked, even though again, that wasn't a therapy session, but we can borrow from that in our support organizations, looking back at the history. So your folks are good now. Have they always been good? What was it like when they weren't? How did that feel for you? How did you get through it? So again, deconstructing some of the narrative to give the individual some space to kind of go with that. All right, so that's a little bit of Miles. I want to introduce another individual to our conversation, and let's see. And this is Angel. I'm trying to think if you need to know anything about Angel. Again, I believe is in her early 20s. Yeah, 2021, something like that. Angel was given the sexual assignment of birth as male. Angel identifies as female. Angel has gone through a long process, particularly in her teen years and thereafter, to more fully identify and present internally and externally as female, as she knows herself to be. As presenting as male in her early childhood and early adolescence, Angel was and is a very gifted athlete. She was a football player in high school, but labeled as a male football player for all intents and purposes. That's how people saw her and thought she was. She is now actually a weightlifter and trainer, so she is still involved in sports. But she was, again, identifying as male in high school. And so Angel's going to talk a little bit about what that was like for her and that process. So we're going to learn a little bit about Angel now. And again, I want you to do the same thing. I want you to think for stressors, and I want you to think about some strengths. Now, we didn't talk about Miles' strengths, so we'll do that with Angel as well. So the last thing that Angel says is, I always feel like I'm being selfish. So I wanted you to hear that piece. All right, so there's just a little bit about Angel. Now, in what we see there from Angel, let's again talk a little bit about some of the stressors, the challenges that she describes facing as she went through her childhood or adolescence and then moving into young adulthood. So we got lack of representation. Sarah, thank you so much for that. Yeah, she very clearly talks about the importance of that. She had no role models. She had a role model as an athlete in her dad, but her dad, as we will see shortly, identifies as a heterosexual cisgendered man. So she didn't have a role model for somebody that was trans in doing what she was doing. And to that, she speaks very clearly and somewhat emotionally, as Joyce is pointing out, to the loss of the relationship with her father, how profound that is for her. I just want my dad back, she says at one point in time. So the all of what she is going through, and yet that need for family support and validation is so crucial, and you can feel it in Angel as she's talking. The suicidal ideation is clearly alluded to. Thank you so much for Bridget for listening and hearing in there, right? So again, that would be an area that I would want to explore with her a bit more, and having Angel talk about some of those difficult times and what was it like and what was that feeling of I would rather not be here any longer. Let's talk about that. Don't shy away from that. Let's talk about that. Actually, the more that we're able to talk about it, the more we lessen its power and we give alternatives to it. And the self-doubt, right? That's a lot of it. This is why that early validation from others, if it can't be from family, then from others is so important. We begin, as we all know, we've all gone through our psychology developmental classes, et cetera, right? Those early messaging is so crucial in terms of our sense of self and how we identify internally. And if one is constantly questioning, doubting, fearing, feeling shame, feeling rejection, how does one ever have a sense of confidence moving forward? And Angel says at one point, actually, when she's meeting with Jonathan, who's doing her hair, I wish I felt as confident out in the world as I do in the gym, right? So the gym is the one place where she feels like she's got it all together and everything is aligned and congruent for her. And she knows what that feeling is like, but she can't have that when she tries to interface with her family and the rest of the world. There's just that piece missing, and she really is striving to move beyond that. And the self-blame, and we hear this a lot, regardless of where somebody falls in the queer spectrum, whether it's around gender or sexual orientation. Oftentimes, a very common part of the narrative is a sense of blame. It's my fault. I wish I had been a better kid. I wish this hadn't been my reality. It would have been easier on everybody else if this hadn't happened. I wish I could make it go away. Those are very common narratives, particularly in the early stages of identity development for queer individuals, is a sense of blame, responsibility, what I call magical thinking, thinking that I can somehow change who I really am, instead of how do I find a way to accept who I really am and and kind of try to compartmentalize out the negative messages of others. But early on, it gets absorbed into this sort of more blaming oneself and feeling responsible, which ties to our risk factors that we talked about earlier. So imagine living your life feeling that way, that you're a failure, that you've let people down, that you could have and should have done something different, to change who you are, to make it easier for everyone else. So when we think about what that would be like living 24/7 like that, and then thinking about the risk factors for this population, depression, suicidal ideation, substance abuse, not living in a home, it makes sense, right? Those risk factors make so much sense. How does one cope with that kind of messaging at a micro level in our family, at a macro level in our country and in our culture? Wow, that's a lot to take on. And so it's understandable that many times these individuals, particularly in the early stages of identity development, find themselves in these risk factors. So let's talk a little bit positively, either Miles and or Angel. What do we see in either one of them that we, from a positive psychology point of view, from an affirming sort of point of view, that we also want to support in them? They both told us about tremendous hurt, tremendous pain. Um, Sarah, I see that you've got your hand up, and I apologize if it's been up for a while. I just noticed it now on my little keyboard, so please,
No,
love
I
to.
just put it up.
Okay, cool.
Yeah. I was just gonna say you see kind of like a sense of boundaries with Miles, where he says like, I don't know how I feel about this party. I'm not sure if I'm gonna be comfortable with it. And you see that kind of intro into him building boundaries around what he is okay with.
Sarah, I love that. I absolutely love that. I want everybody to really kind of take that in. So Miles is demonstrating now, I don't have to be a victim to all of this stuff. I do have agency here, and I am allowed to set a limit. The party that's alluded to, and I should have said that at the intro. Sorry for folks that haven't seen the show before. His mom is planning a reunion for the church community, a homecoming, and she wanted Miles to come back after several years of being away. And so he's really debating whether or not he really wants to take that on. And now he knows, which is what Sarah's implying. Now he knows and is beginning to live in the space of, and I get to choose now. I get to choose whether I go back to those folks and on what terms I go back to see those people. And that if for example, if I was working clinically or in an advocacy role with him, that I would be fully supporting and pointing out. He may not even be aware that that's what he just said and did, right? So us giving language to that. Wow, Miles, could you imagine when you were 9 years old and your mom was planning the reunion party back then? Could you imagine not going then? And my guess would be he would say, no, I'd have to go. My mom says I go and I would have to go. And look where you are now. Now you know you don't have to go anymore. Now you get to choose what you want to do. So finding that little bit of strength wherever it is and helping to magnify it, because many times the clients that we're dealing with these issues really can't see that in themselves. They are so overwhelmed by all of the other negative stressors that it's hard for them even to see the part of themselves that is really thriving and surviving in an amazing way. Thanks so much for that, Sarah. I really love that. Determination, Bridget put the determination and perseverance. Alexandra, thank you for that as well. And Jen put steps moving forward, right? So absolutely, those may be things that that individual just doesn't even notice, or we may not even really notice. And so I really ask you to think about in working with these clients in whatever ways that you do to find these little moments and really expand upon them. They need that. They have to find a way to build something from the positive. So looking at that. All right, let's move on. In the interest of time, I want to do a little bit of the family stuff as well as it relates to all of this. So let's move on, and I'm going to introduce you to, let's see, we'll do Miles's mom first. She's going to talk a little bit about her experience. This scene, again, I had to work with the show that I got, so I had to edit around and cut around what I could cut around. Miles's mom is at a kitchen table with two of her sisters and one of her aunts, I believe. And they're all making this banana dessert thing that I would love to have because it looks so delicious. But they're making this food and they're having this conversation with one of the hosts of the show. And Miles' mom is going to talk a little bit about her journey of understanding Miles as a gay man. So that's a little bit of Angel's dad. So again, just and it's a very brief clip. What jumps out at you in that clip? What did you hear? What did you feel? What got activated in you? What question might you have had, or what might you have wanted to support him in? What did you get from Dad? Grief. Thanks, Jen. Yeah, the grief is profound, right? And isn't it interesting because we heard the grief from Angel as well, right? That parallel process of grief. They are both profoundly missing each other. And I find this over and over and over again. You know, we talk many times, and I've talked today because of using Dr. Ryan's work. We talk about rejection and family rejection, right? And yet, oftentimes, I find even in the families that on the surface I feel like are most rejecting, it's almost a facade. If you can get underneath that, there is actual tremendous desire to stay connected or to reconnect or to build a bridge. This dad does not want the separation that he has from his daughter. That's abundantly clear. Look at his face. I mean, you can't look at that face without. I've seen that clip 100 times, and I still tear up when I watch him. Right? And that grief is so profound. Lacey says, "I wonder if parents sometimes feel like it's their fault for their child's differences." Absolutely, that is such a frequent narrative, not always, but a frequent narrative for parents. And that's something that, again, we don't always give the time to explore. This is one of the places where I'm not criticizing the show because the show's for other reasons, but just reminding us that the show is not meant to be a clinical show. Karamo jumped in really quickly when the dad started to talk about his grief and his not knowing if he could see his daughter looking as she does now. And Karamo very quickly says, you know, I know you think she's going to be different, but when you see her, you're going to see that she's still the same person that you've always loved. That's a lovely statement, right? It may turn out to be a true statement, but if this was a clinical interaction, it was what I would call an untimely statement. That was not the time for that statement. What I would have done at that point is to let dad sit with that grief some more. Tell me about what you miss about your child. Tell me about what you fantasize about reconnecting with your child, if it could be. What would it look like? You want to be able to be in that moment to allow the dad to explore his grief. There's where, Lacey, something may come up with where he may, because he says at one point, I want to know how this all happened. Where did that change happen? Now, one of the things may be he may be feeling a sense of responsibility. Did I do something wrong as a father? Was it my fault that this happened? You want him to be able to explore that. Now, we want to also give him information and education at some point in time that says that may not necessarily, that dispels that myth, but we want to be able to give him a platform to be able to explore that possibility. Parents often feel like it is their fault or their responsibility. And while we know that that is not true, that's not how sexual orientation and gender identity comes about, we also know that that grief and loss needs to be explored and expressed. Brandy mentions he's a bit afraid of change. Absolutely, as we all are. Change is very seldom welcomed by most of us. Some people are out there, and good for you, those of you, but the vast majority of us don't love change. And we certainly don't love change as it relates to the fantasies that we have around who our children are. This is the biggest challenge, I think, for parents of queer kids. We all have expectations, hopes, dreams, fantasies of what our child's life is going to be like. And when a child comes out as queer, that has to change for most of us. It's changing a little bit. There are some parents these days that allow for the possibility of that, but that is still more the exception than the rule. And so we have a heterosexual, cisgendered kind of fantasy of how our children's lives are going to be. And this breaks that. And we have to deal with the grief and loss of that before we can accept, if we're going to, the joy and excitement of what could be now, but not heterosexual and cisgendered, right? Sarah, please.
I was just going to say it's really interesting how he kind of glosses over it and goes over it really quickly, but he basically says something about like, there was all this discussion about bathrooms and all these issues out in the world, and I never thought it was going to come into my house, and then it was in my house.
Yeah,
So it's interesting how he kind of talks about he's like aware of the politicization of his own child.
yeah. Thanks, Sarah, for that. And that speaks to a much bigger issue, which we see many times, which is around a variety of issues, right? Sometimes it is hard for a lot of us on issues to be empathic around those issues unless and until it hits home. And then when it hits home, it's like, whoa, how did I not see this? Or wow, that is not really fair because now it's my kid, now it's me, now it's my neighbor, now it's somebody I love, right? And so unfortunately, and it is part of human nature, that sometimes we can't see beyond ourselves unless and until it hits home. And for dad, now it is hitting home. Let me see, I'm trying to read some of these things in chat really quickly to make sure I get everybody in here. So for many of those families, they also have no knowledge or experience of anyone from the LGBTQIA plus community. So they have the negative assumptions that go with it. Absolutely, Joyce. And I would add to that, absolutely. So they may have wrong information, misinformation, judgmental information. And another piece that they have where there's a parallel process is they may also feel very alone. I don't know any other family that's going through this. Now, that may not be true. They may actually know families that are going through it, but the families aren't talking about it, right? But they feel so alone. Not unlike, remember Miles at the beginning talking about that loneliness and me saying to all of you that that's such a common narrative for kids and adults as they come out. It is a common narrative for parents and families as well to feel very alone with this. I can't tell people in my church, we may get thrown out. What do I say at the PTA if they find this out about my kid? I don't know where to get information. I'm not going to go to the gay and lesbian center. I'm not gay and lesbian myself. What if a neighbor sees me walk in and asks, why am I there? All of those same kind of fears. There's such a parallel process for the parents to come out as for the queer child to come out as well. And so acknowledging that, talking about what it's like to live in that isolation. And then, if and when they're ready, to provide resources to break that isolation. So we talked about for queer youth, there's lots of organizations out there for parents of queer individuals. There are as well. There's the Family Acceptance Project, which we talked about. There's PFLAG, Parents or Friends of Lesbians and Gays, also in your resource material that you're going to get at the end. Wonderful organization, support organization. There's chapters all across the United States. Also can be done via Zoom and electronically, so one doesn't have to necessarily physically go to a space to be there to get support from others. So keeping that in mind, that the isolation that we hear in queer individuals, we often hear in families of queer individuals as well. And the more we can break that isolation, the more opportunity we have to give them accurate information and the emotional support that they need as well. But welcoming in their grief and loss and giving them time for that. I've let parents sit and say, I really wish that they weren't queer. It's not that I don't love my kid. Their life would be so much easier if they weren't. That's fair. That's understandable. I get that. It's okay to be able to acknowledge that. I've had others say, I wish it would change. I'm going to learn how to accept this, but I really wish it would change, just in my heart and soul that I do. And it's a disappointment. I have to be able to sit with that. I have to sit with that. But what do we do to support your kid nonetheless? Right? So sitting with it can be hard sometimes. Again, our own feelings may get in the way. Oh God, this mom is so compassionate and so smart. How come I can't get her to just get over that and really love that kid? That's my agenda. That's not being with my client. Then if I'm there to support that parent, I've got to support them wherever they are in the journey. All right, last piece, because I'm looking at time and I want to give some time at the end. Oh, I'm sorry, Rory. I see your hand. Apologize. I didn't see the bottom of the screen there. Please.
That's totally okay. I just wanted to touch on a little bit about the motivation that parents have for not wanting their children to be
Yeah.
queer. I came out probably when I was like 22. I came out as not only bisexual but non-binary, and that was really difficult for my parents. They are very accepting now. They are trying really hard. They're even teaching my nieces and nephews the proper language to use when speaking about me. But in multiple conversations I've had with my mother, it is that she just feels so upset and sad that I have to go through so much discrimination and hardships, and that is the main reason why she wishes that I weren't queer.
Oof. Rory, thank you on so many levels. Thank you, first of all, for sharing part of your journey with us as well. I really appreciate that and respect you. I'm so happy to hear that you have a supportive mom, and she's got to be an amazing woman, and you're very lucky, and I know you know that, and she's lucky to have you. And I love what you're speaking to. And again, this is where we have to always watch our judgments, our projections, our assumptions. We may have a parent that on the surface appears to be rejecting, right? And yet, if we dig underneath that, as is in the case in Rory's parent, what Rory's mom is being a really good mom. She is saying, if I could create the world in such a way that my child would be loved and fully accepted for who they are, that's the world I want them to live in. But I know it's not the world that my child's living in. And I wish that it was different. That's my struggle. It's not that I don't love my child. I am frustrated and angry at the world that the world can't see the beauty of who my child is and gets caught in these binary terms, right? That's a loving, caring, wonderful mom. But that may have been misinterpreted at first, maybe by the child themselves, or maybe by others, if we don't dig underneath it. What's that about? What do you think that's about? So
It
for
definitely was misinterpreted at first.
I bet.
It took a lot of conversation and a lot of working together to come to an understanding that that's where she was coming from.
Wow. Congratulations to you both for being on that journey, right? So that took a lot of hard work, a
Thank
lot
you.
of vulnerability, a lot of risk taking, a lot of hurt and pain, I'm sure, that goes into all of that as well. But you got there, and how amazing. That's wonderful. Rory, thank you so much for that. I'm so glad that you shared that. All right, last clip we're going to show, sort of speaking to that, Rory. This is kind of a cool sort of transition into our last piece as well. We're going to see one last piece with Angel's dad. And I'm just going to let it speak for itself, and we'll go from there and see how you respond to it. Okay. Okay. So put the Kleenex boxes to the side, and that one gets me every single time. Couple of things. We only got a couple of minutes left, so I'm going to kind of wrap it up myself. I would love to hear your comments on it. Couple things that we saw there. First and foremost, just from a structural point of view, again, this is a reality TV show. It's set up in a certain way. I would never, ever have sprung on her at the last minute that dad's going to come over and we're going to have that conversation. Obviously, that's something that would have taken a lot of thought, consideration, talking to both of them, making sure they're both ready for that sort of thing. So just to add that piece. But what you saw there also was a really genuine kind of sharing of the grief between the two of them and then the desire to reunify. I do have to add, as always, I love ending with this piece because it gives us hope. It reminds us that most of our families ultimately want this, and that if we can find ways to support them, we can get there. I do want to remind us some families aren't going to get there. Some families can't get there for whatever reason. It is just too far for them to go. And so we may be working with youth that we have to find supplements for that. It isn't going to be their biological family, or maybe it's an extension of their biological family that they connect with. It may be us for a period of time that they borrow as that source of support. It may be friends or other community members. And so not everybody gets this sort of resolution within the family. So I wanted to be honest about that as well. Um, but many of our families could get there if we give them the time, the space, and the support that they need. We've just got a minute or two left, so I am going to just remind you that the PowerPoint is available to you. It's got a lot of great information in it. I am available at any point in time. My email is in there, so feel free to send any kind of questions, concerns. If you're looking for a resource as well, happy to try to provide that to you if it's something that I can provide for you. And let me see if I can get us back to the PowerPoint. I can.
And as he's pulling that up, I just want to say on behalf of CalTrin, on behalf of the participants, we want to say thank you so much for the expertise, the information, the strategies that you brought with you today.